Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Maha Yahya. I'm the director of the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. I'm absolutely delighted to be opening the fourth installment of our annual conference, A Global Renewal with a question mark, about what to expect in 2021, with our very own Carnegie Endowment President, Ambassador Bill Burns. Welcome to today. Let me begin, Ambassador Burns, by talking about US elections. We're looking at, this is a momentous time, not only for the United States, but also for the rest of the world. Globally, we've been hit by a pandemic and economic turndown, but this is coming on the heels of 4 years of extremely polarized politics, both in the US, but also around the world, a disintegration in multilateralism, so on and so forth. We saw record turnouts in the United States for voting. I believe it was in the order of around 150 million. Almost split in half, more for President-elect Biden, but almost split in half. So let me begin with the first question in terms of what does this mean for, what do the US election results tell us about the state of domestic American politics, especially the fact that even though he lost the election, President Trump made significant gains in terms of overall votes, and the Republican Party actually added many seats in the House, and depending on the by-election in Georgia, may well retain control of the Senate. Over to you, Bill.
Well, Maha, first, it's great to be with you as always, and I really am very proud of the work that you and your colleagues at the Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center continue to do across the region. 2020, to make an understatement, as recovering diplomats are apt to do, was a very hard year for all of us around the world, particularly for the people of Beirut, a city that I've loved ever since I first visited nearly 40 years ago. And so for the Carnegie Endowment, our decision to rename the center in honor of Malcolm Kerr a few months ago was not only a tribute to a wonderful man, but it also was a signal of our commitment to Beirut as the platform for our work across the region. So now on your question about American politics and the election outcome and the health of American democracy, I mean, the honest answer is, if Donald Trump, in my view, had been reelected for a second 4 years as president, then American democracy would have gone straight into the intensive care unit. With President-elect Biden's victory in the election, I think American democracy is on the road to recovery, but it's bound to be a very difficult and fragile recovery. And I say that recognizing, as you just remarked, Maha, that much of what happened in terms of the result and the process in our recent elections should give us hope. The highest turnout in American political history in the midst of a pandemic, which is not a small thing, and relatively few problems with the process, despite President Trump's continuing efforts to invent them. But it did underscore, as you said, the continued polarization and tribalism in American politics. And that's going to create a huge challenge for effective governance. I think President-elect Biden's experience and his instincts and his inclination all make him ideally suited in many ways to try to bridge those differences, but it's going to be a very tall order. And the last thing I'd say in general terms as we reflect on the election is that it did underscore, I think, something we've worked hard on at Carnegie over the course of the last couple of years, and that is the connection between an effective and sustainable American foreign policy and domestic renewal. Because for too long, the gap between people like me, card-carrying members of the Washington policy establishment, and lots of American citizens on foreign policy has grown wider and wider. Most Americans, in my experience, don't need to be persuaded of the importance of American engagement in the world, but they've become increasingly skeptical over administrations of both political parties about the capacity of decision makers to be disciplined in that engagement, to match ends to means, and especially to conduct foreign policy in a way which is going to help Americans deal with all those huge and sometimes crushing domestic problems of growing economic inequality, to show that a smart foreign policy really can be the first line of defense against inevitable external shocks, whether it's climate change or global health insecurity or the revolution in technology. So that's another of the ways, I think, in which our recent elections have underscored what really is the historic significance of better connecting foreign policy to domestic renewal.
Building on this internally, can you perhaps elaborate a little bit on what a domestic renewal is likely to look like? And then we'll talk a bit about the unusual transition and what that means.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the first, second, and third most important priorities for the Biden administration are going to be, navigating past the pandemic, which is a huge challenge for Americans. I mean, it's a very sad commentary that America first has come to mean over this horrible last year, being first in all the wrong categories, in number of infections, a number of deaths, and the competence that national leadership, or the incompetence of national leadership in dealing with, what would be terrible problems for any administration to deal with. And then the related challenge of economic recovery, which is bound to be difficult and painful coming out of the impact of the pandemic. So that's going to be the first challenge. But then I think what the Biden administration is determined to do, based on what President-elect Biden has discussed, is to try to address some of those deeper drivers of dysfunction in the United States, having everything running the gamut of issues, from racial injustice to judicial and penal reform in the United States, to moving the American economy and American society more in the direction of clean energy and renewable energies, given the huge challenge of climate change, rebuilding infrastructure in the United States, which is an embarrassment in many ways, as foreign visitors to the U.S. can see these days. So some huge challenges to deal with those underlying problems. But, I think President-elect Biden has been quite clear-eyed about the significance of thinking ambitiously about those problems. He'll obviously be constrained if you have a Republican-led Senate in terms of, ambitious attempts to build more resources and more appropriations for those efforts. But I think he's going to work very hard to try to demonstrate to Americans the importance of finding common ground on those issues without in any way being naive about all of those political problems that still exist. So 2021, I think, in a lot of ways is going to be as important for the United States as, 1989 was at the end of the Cold War. It's going to be one of those, hinge points where I think strong and disciplined leadership can go a very long way in dealing with some of those domestic problems. And of course, as you said at the outset, recovering the power of America's example of our competence after the experience of the last few years is going to be a critical driver of effective American foreign policy too.
And bridging the gap within, I think, US society. I mean, we've never seen these kinds of vertical divisions with people actually drawing examples between the US. One of our own colleagues said the US is becoming Beirut, Lebanon in some ways, in terms of the vertical divisions we've seen, societal divisions. We've never seen anything this clear, I would say, and this deep in some ways.
No, I agree. And I thought that was a terrific piece that our colleague did, that Kim Gaddis did.
Absolutely.
And I think it should be sobering for Americans because, over the decades, and I did this as a diplomat, Americans are very free with our advice to other societies. And we've tended oftentimes to think the world revolves around us. The truth is we have a lot to learn from the experiences, both the good, the bad, and the ugly of other societies. And, our own political system has become quite stagnant. And so we need to pay attention to the examples that we see in other societies that face a lot of the same problems.
Let me turn to another question, Bill. Just how do you think, I mean, we're seeing a very unusual transition where the president still has not conceded the election, still talks about voter fraud. It's been almost, like pulling teeth, trying to get the president-elect's team, give them access to what they should be getting. How do you think this very unusual transition is going to impact the Biden administration's foreign policy? Where will their priorities be? And maybe then we can perhaps talk a bit about the Middle East and
Sure.
where that fits into it.
Sure. Well, first I'd say transitions matter enormously. In the American political system, I worked over the years as a diplomat for 5 presidents and 10 secretaries of state. On 2 different occasions, I led the State Department side of a transition with a new administration coming in. And so I have a very clear sense of how important it is to try to make as smooth a handoff as you can. One of the best transitions that I ever witnessed was in 2008, 2009, from the George W. Bush administration to the first term of Barack Obama's administration. Both sides had a very professional approach, and it made a big difference in terms of how that transition played out. By contrast, in the transition from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush, 2000 to 2001, because it was delayed by the Florida recount and the controversy, or the difficulty at least, of formally concluding the election. As the report that was later done about 9/11, the 9/11 Commission underscored, that had a consequence in terms of the pace of a new administration's ability to come to grips with a lot of threats that were out there. So my point is simply that transitions are important. This transition is bound to be the messiest in American political history for several reasons. First, as you said, you have a president who has effectively checked out of his job, who's obsessing right now over the election itself, is transfixed by trying to cast illegitimacy over the outcome and President-elect Biden's victory. Second, you have disarray within the bureaucracy, which has been true for much of the last 4 years, with the hollowing out of a lot of institutions and casting doubt on career public servants. So you have that disarray as well. And then third and not least, you still have some senior advisors around the president who, even with 30 or 40 days left in the transition, are still looking for ways in which they can either box in a new administration in some policy areas or employ scorched earth tactics to complicate the life of a new administration on issues ranging from China to Iran as well. So a lot can happen in the next 30 or 40 days, which will affect the inheritance of the Biden administration. I think, to get to your question about the priorities of the new administration, I mean, I can't speak for the Biden administration, but what I would observe is that I think this is bound to be the most difficult inheritance that any new president has faced since Franklin Roosevelt at the height of the Great Depression 90 years ago, almost 90 years ago. I think President-elect Biden and the team that he's putting together around him, which is an exceptional team, are well aware of the reality that the world they're returning to after 4 years is not the same as the one that they left. On the domestic landscape, all the dysfunctions we were discussing earlier apply. On the international landscape, I think this is one of those very rare plastic moments that comes along, maybe a couple of times a century in international order, transformative moments. This one characterized, I think, by 3 main features. First, major changes in the balance of power among states, especially with the rise of China. Second, major challenges that go beyond the reach of any one state. Those problems without passports, like climate change, or the phenomenon of cyber intrusions, or the broader revolution in technology or global health insecurity. And then third, and not least, major uncertainties about the role of the main driver of the old post-Cold War international order, my own country, the United States, which is, especially over the last 4 years, seen by too many people around the world to be erratic or unsteady at the wheel. So on the 20th of January, we'll have a new and I think infinitely more competent and reliable driver. But it's not as if the United States can just kind of return to the seat that it held before at the head of the table internationally and be surrounded by deferential allies and partners and suitably impressed rivals. We're going to have to earn that, that ability to play a leadership role. And that is only going to come through a much more disciplined approach to leadership, connecting ends to means. And as I said, focusing on the priority of domestic renewal, on the priority of recovering the habit of working with other countries and dealing with those big global challenges. So not only returning to the Paris Climate Agreement, but demonstrating through our domestic actions our commitment to clean energy. And then the biggest geopolitical test, for the United States, as far as I can see it, at the 21st century, and that's going to be managing an intense long-term competition with China. A China that is in many ways more vibrant economically and more durable politically than the Soviet Union ever was during the height of the Cold War. But the United States has, I would argue, and I don't mean this as a statement of American arrogance, has a reasonable hand to play. I would argue a better hand to play than any of our major rivals, not just because of our economic leverage and our military leverage, but because of our capacity to draw on alliances, mobilize coalitions of countries. I mean, that's in a way the capacity that sets the United States apart from lonelier powers like China and Russia. But we're going to have to work very hard at that, because a lot of those alliances and partnerships are going to have to be rebuilt, as Biden says, built back better. And that's going to require a lot of effort beyond, the initial size of relief in at least many parts of the world, and the initial kind of, mutually self-congratulatory summits and meetings. It's going to require a lot of hard work to reinvent a lot of those relationships.
How do you see, since we're talking about relationships, I mean, one of the relationships that took a significant hit, obviously, is the one with Europe, the transatlantic relationship, whether on trade, but also on foreign policy, on multiple avenues. How do you see the Biden administration going about perhaps mending those ties, the relationship with NATO and with others?
Well, I mean,
just elaborate on.
Sure, no. And when I talk about, the high priority that the United States is going to have to attach to managing competition with China, rivalry with China over the coming decades, I don't mean to suggest that other priorities don't matter. And certainly the transatlantic relationship matters enormously. In recent years, we've seen what are in effect political nervous breakdowns on both sides of the Atlantic. And you've seen a Trump administration, which has actually been a cheerleader, not just for Brexit, but for fragmentation of the European Union, and has cast doubt on, the wisdom of the NATO alliance as well, and the nature of America's commitment to it. So there's a lot of, rebuilding to do, given the corrosive damage that's been done. What's going to be important, I think, in transatlantic relations is to focus, of course, on security issues and the importance, of European allies stepping up and, doing their share of taking on those security missions and improving their own defenses. But it's also going to mean the United States being a little less patronizing, which tends to be our attitude oftentimes, and Europeans, by the same token, being willing to take more initiative and, absorb more risk. So not just on security issues, but on questions of recovering from the pandemic and economic recovery, on beginning to develop workable rules of the road on technology, narrowing the differences which are obvious today between the EU and the United States over questions of taxation and regulation and the geopolitics of data. Because if we can't narrow those differences with allies and partners in Europe, there's no way that any of us are going to build up the leverage to be able to deal effectively with much different visions coming from authoritarian countries like China or Russia on many of those same issues. So, and climate change is obviously another opportunity, I think, to deepen cooperation between the United States and Europe. China and the challenge that China poses is obviously going to be another, important priority in transatlantic relations. And in saying that, I don't mean to suggest that what is likely to emerge is an identical set of strategies to dealing with China. But I do think it's possible to build complementary and coordinated strategies in dealing with, challenges ranging from 5G technology all the way through global health cooperation as well. So a transatlantic alliance, I think, becomes very important in terms of each of those priorities that I mentioned before that I think the Biden administration is going to have to focus on.
Let me move to another tenuous relationship, which is Russia. You spent a good part of your own professional career in Russia. I'd like to hear from you perhaps how you see a Biden administration relationship with Russia. Will we see a change in policy, a change in attitude, or more of the same when it comes to Russia? Both on international issues, but also I think in relation, let's use that to kind of make our way into the Middle East slowly.
Sure. No. Well, most of my white hair came from serving in Russia, at least the parts of my white hair that didn't come from serving in the Middle East. Both are challenging sets of issues. I guess what I would say is that I think, American strategy toward Russia, American relations with Russia are probably going to operate in a Biden administration and beyond that within a pretty narrow range of possibilities, from the sharply competitive to the nastily adversarial. In my experience, Vladimir Putin is a very combustible combination of ambition and grievance and insecurity. He's been, in the now nearly 20 years, or the 20 years that he's been Russia's leader, kind of an apostle of payback in dealing with the United States, giving his sharp sense of Russia's period of humiliation in the 1990s after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and a period in which I served in our embassy in Moscow, so I remember it vividly. I still remember vividly also my first meeting with Putin as the newly arrived US ambassador in Moscow. This was August of 2005, and the meeting takes place in the Kremlin, which, as some in your audience may know, is a place that's built on a scale that's meant to intimidate visitors, especially newly arrived American ambassadors. So you walk down these long corridors, through these huge ornate rooms, and you come to the end of one of these huge ornate rooms, and there are these 2-story bronze doors. You're kept waiting there for a few minutes just to let all this sink in. And the door opens a crack, and out comes President Vladimir Putin, who, despite his bare-chested persona, is not all that intimidating in the flesh, but he carries himself with great self-assurance. So he came through the door, and before I got a word out of my mouth, says in Russian, "You Americans need to listen more. You can't have everything your own way anymore. We can have effective relations, but not just on your terms." In my experience, that was vintage Vladimir Putin. It was not subtle. It was almost defiantly charmless. But the message was that, Russia's going to push back in areas that it sees to be vital to its interests. And so that doesn't mean that you don't need guardrails in the US-Russia relationship. I think one of the early challenges for the Biden administration is going to be the reality that the New START agreement, which reduces, verifies, monitors the strategic nuclear arsenals of the United States and Russia, still today the only 2 nuclear superpowers in the world, that agreement is going to expire in February of next year. So a couple of weeks after, President-elect Biden is inaugurated. There's a very strong argument for extending that agreement as is provided for in the treaty. And that's going to be an important demonstration, I think, that for all of our very sharp differences, the United States and Russia have both unique capacities in the nuclear area, but also unique responsibilities as well. And then, just as you suggested in the Middle East, whether Americans like it or not, it's going to be important to deal with the Russian government, given its own influence, especially increased influence over the last, 5 or 6 years in different parts of the Middle East. So it's going to be again, to put it mildly, a very challenging relationship for the new administration to manage.
Let me then, since we've moved to the Middle East, you were involved previously in all the back channel negotiations with Iran, and you've written about this in your book, as well as your sojourn in Russia. Let me ask you, what will the Biden policy towards Iran, do you think, be, and how would the possibility of a Trump administration escalation with Iran complicate what seems to be President-elect Biden's push to renew or re-enter the JCPOA, and then kind of work on other things simultaneously? I mean, the drive, from what we've heard from the incoming administration, really is to sequence, first get back into the JCPOA and then start talking about other things, including sanctions relief, including a regional dialogue. I mean, all the issues that were kind of more of a bottleneck at the time, and that served to derail, I think, the JCPOA in some ways, or at least it wasn't greeted with open arms in different sectors or amongst different groups of people.
Yeah, I noticed that over the years. No, I mean, I think you're right. The President-elect Biden and his incoming senior advisors have made clear that their intent is to return to compliance with the Comprehensive Nuclear Agreement if, and it's a big if, the Iranian government is prepared to return to full compliance as well. The Biden team has made equally clear that they see the challenge of Iran and American policy as part of a comprehensive strategy, of which the nuclear issue is only one part. On the nuclear issue, Biden has made clear that he would simultaneously with returning to compliance, if that becomes possible, initiate an effort to build on that first agreement and strengthen the nuclear agreement in ways that are going to further ensure that Iran will be prevented from developing a nuclear weapon. I mean, even when the last administration negotiated the Comprehensive Nuclear Agreement, we all understood that this was meant to be the beginning of diplomacy, not the end of it. Like any arms control process, you build on it. But that's only, as you well know, one part of the challenge that's posed by, this Iranian regime, this Iranian government. Its development of increasingly sophisticated ballistic missiles are an obvious concern and an obvious challenge. And so are continuing efforts on the part of the Iranian government to subvert other governments throughout the region. So that's going to require very close cooperation, I'm sure, in a Biden administration with our partners in the region. I think there are, again, without being naive about it, I think there are a few places where there may be some possibilities for hard-nosed diplomacy along those lines. Yemen, I think, could be one of them. Again, as you know very well, not only a strategic catastrophe, but a humanitarian catastrophe, the worst one on the planet today. An effort at serious diplomacy in which the United States has a very active role is long overdue. And that's going to require not just pushing the Iranians, given their backing for the Houthis in Yemen, but it's also going to require pushing the Saudis as well on this issue. And, we can get to that later. But I mean, I think, after 4 years of, what I would argue are kind of blind indulgence of the current Saudi leadership, at least on a variety of fronts, on Yemen, on a number of human rights issues, not least the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a fairly mild-mannered critic of the Saudi regime in a Saudi diplomatic facility in Istanbul. It's important for the United States not to check its values at the door on issues like that, but to push back hard. But I do think on Yemen, there could be an opportunity, and I recognize all the difficulties in making diplomatic progress, but this could be a moment where a Biden administration could help make a difference and help bring about a real possibility of a diplomatic settlement there, because it's long overdue, as I said before. And that's going to require pushing the Iranians, but also pushing the Saudis, I think.
No, I couldn't agree more. But let me ask just one other question on the Iran issue, which is, do you think there are policies that were enacted by the Trump administration which the Biden administration would be able to leverage in its negotiations with Iran. And I'm thinking in particular things like the sanctions. I mean, some of the earlier sanctions, not the more recent ones. Are there things that could also help push some of the negotiations further in this sense?
Well, I mean, I think, much as I've disagreed with the Trump administration's approach, the maximum pressure approach, it's done, enormous damage to the Iranian economy. And there are a lot of, Iranian citizens, who are suffering as a result of that too. So that's created a circumstance, I think, in which, there may be greater incentive for the Iranian government to try to move back to compliance with the comprehensive agreement. But I think that, at least as I understand what President-elect Biden has said, is the immediate objective, which is to return to full compliance, which would mean the United States returning to full compliance as well in terms of sanctions relief as well. It's going to be important, I think, to de-escalate the rhetoric early on, and also to de-escalate, in terms of some of the restrictions on humanitarian supplies going to Iran, which have contributed to real human suffering there. And, this is a population that suffers enough already from a deeply repressive leadership. So I think there are things that could be done early on that might increase the odds of a successful return to compliance. But as I said, that's just, one step in what has to be a comprehensive approach or a comprehensive strategy in dealing with, with the challenge posed by this Iranian leadership.
Especially assuming we need to know what Iran wants at the end of the day, because that also will play. And enrichment, it seems, has increased tremendously in the past few years.
Well, and that's been the downside, the huge downside of the maximum pressure approach, which originally it was argued would produce a better nuclear agreement. And instead, what we have is not only no nuclear agreement, in effect, but also, an Iranian government which is steadily moving out of compliance, which has, built up a stockpile of enriched uranium, which I think at last count was 12 times what it was, when the Trump administration came into office. So, the Iranian leadership has been building up its own chits in a way for, the diplomacy that's to come. And so, I understand how difficult this process will be, having lived through it before, but I do think that President-elect Biden is focused on the right issue at the start. And then the challenge, if that's successful, is going to be to, build a strategy that deals comprehensively with that whole range of ways in which Iran can threaten the interests of, friends and partners across the region.
Let me use that then as a segue to talk about the friends and partners in the region. President-elect Biden has talked about having after the values-free holiday that we've had over the past 4 years, he's talking about bringing values back to foreign policy, making foreign policy be values-based. What would that mean in a region that is now coming up on the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring, and where we've seen tremendous authoritarian regression in multiple places across the region? How do you see U.S. policy playing out in such a context? And where do you see? I mean, what is the future of democracy? I would say in countries across the region.
Well, I mentioned before, Maha, you raise a very profound question, and one that oftentimes doesn't get the attention it deserves in American strategy in the Middle East. I recognize as clearly, I think, as anyone, the trade-offs that are often involved in policies in dealing with authoritarian regimes. But it's a huge mistake, as I said before, it would be a huge mistake to continue the values holiday we've seen over the last 4 years. And I say that for, a very simple reason. I think that while a lot has changed in the region in the 10 years since the Arab Spring, what hasn't changed are the underlying causes of the Arab Spring, of those revolutions across the Arab world. And you know this far better than I do. The indignity that caused people to go out in the street courageously and protest against, deeply repressive leaderships. the sense of lack of economic opportunity and fairness, the inability of people to express themselves politically in many societies. And the challenge, of course, is that leaderships and societies in the Arab world or any place else that don't address those underlying challenges are going to become brittle and break. And those that do, I think, have a chance of becoming healthier and more durable and more sustainable. And they also are better partners for outsiders like the United States over time. So none of this is a favor to the United States. It's deeply in the self-interest of societies across the region. Having said that, the honest answer about Arab democracy today is, I talked before about, had Trump been reelected in the United States, American democracy going into the intensive care unit. Well, that's exactly where Arab democracy is right now. Not a terminal condition. I'm enough of an optimist about what's possible. And I remember vividly what all of us saw on the screens and experienced 10 years ago. But, this is going to be a tall order because the counter reaction was massive across the region, and it continues to be very powerful. So where does this leave American strategy? I mean, first, I think we have to, Americans, in terms of the US government's policy, have to keep focused on the deeper drivers of dysfunction in the region. And here, again, what you and Marwan Mouasher and our colleagues, in the Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center have done for the last few years in focusing on those deeper drivers of change, I think has been a real service, especially to the younger generation of thinkers and practitioners across the region, because that's the great social, political, economic challenge ahead. And the United States needs to pay attention to that. Of course, we need to recognize the limits of our influence. We spent a good bit of the 2 decades after 9/11 engaged in magical thinking about our capacity to transform other societies, especially in the Middle East, while at the same time neglecting the importance of transforming our own society, as the consequences of globalization became clearer and clearer. So we have to recognize the limits of our influence. And I suppose for a Biden administration, we also have to recognize the importance of rebuilding the power of our example in the world. I always found as a diplomat, whether it was in the Middle East or elsewhere, we get a lot farther through the power of our example than we do through the power of our preaching, freely dispensed as that often is. And we have a very corroded power of example right now that, we're going to have to work hard to rebuild. But assuming we can do that, I think we have to be willing to speak out on issues of human dignity and human rights and civil society, whether with regard to non-Arab players in the Middle East, like Iran, as I mentioned before, or the increasingly illiberal democracy in Turkey, or, longtime partners of the United States in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia as well. A continuing values holiday, a continuing blind indulgence of autocratic regimes on those issues, no matter how many other areas in which we cold-bloodedly need to try to work together, that's going to be a mistake for American policy. And I've made as many mistakes over the course of my career on those issues as anyone. I know how hard it is to get that balance right. But I think in the Biden administration, you're going to see much more of a focus on those issues by contrast to what we've seen over the last 4 years. And that's a good thing.
It would be a very good thing, actually, especially, this for people in the region where we've seen, for example, President Macron just gave the Légion d'honneur to President Sisi, who, literally days after we know how repressive the regime in Egypt has been. Okay, I'm going to end, Bill, with with this fantastic discussion with one last question. We cannot finish without talking about Lebanon. Mm-hmm. You've traveled in and out of Lebanon since the 1980s, the early 1980s, actually. Could you perhaps say a few words about how you see it fit into a broader US policy towards the region?
Well,
perhaps some words of optimism.
Yeah, no, I'll try to close on a more uplifting note if I can. But the first thing I'd say is that, as you know, and any Lebanese citizen knows far better than me or any other outsider, it's a pretty grim diagnosis today. An economic collapse, aggravated badly by the terrible explosion in Beirut last August. a stagnant and in many ways deeply corrupt political system, dealing with the continuing burdens for Lebanese society of the spillover from the civil war in Syria, whether that's refugee issues or other kind of problems, and dealing with the habit, over the decades, not only of Lebanese leaders to deepen the tribalism of Lebanese politics, but for outsiders to take advantage of that, to be predators in a sense on that. And there are plenty of those today as well, with Iran, I think, being near the top of the list. And so it is a pretty grim diagnosis. Having said that, I've seen Lebanon in a number of different states, from the civil war, that was still raging in the 1980s, failed foreign interventions, including the US military intervention when I was a very young diplomat serving at the embassy in Jordan and visiting Beirut, to, much more uplifting moments. I was leaving just at the end of 4 years as the head of the Near East Bureau in the State Department at the beginning of 2005 when the Cedar Revolution took place. And there I saw, a manifestation of resilience on the part of Lebanese. And so I can only imagine how hard it is today. But I do hope for two things. The first is that, Lebanese themselves will be able to recover that sense of resilience, and that outsiders, friends like the United States needs to continue to be, will pay attention and will try to focus its assistance on, on areas which really are deeply in need of reform, to hold Lebanese political leaders to account in ways that will serve not only the Lebanese people over the short, medium, and long term, but also serve the interests of a healthy US-Lebanon partnership over that time as well. So I don't mean to underestimate any of the challenges, but I do hope very much that in the years ahead, American administrations will pay attention to Lebanon, because, again, as you know far better than I do, it's an extremely fragile state today, and the United States does have a stake in Lebanon's stability and in its future health, as grim as the circumstances may seem today.
Bill, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation and a great tour of a broad range of issues that will be facing the US and the world. I'm still hoping for some sort of a global renewal, but we all have to wait and see.
Me too. No, I'm an optimist by nature, and now you'll have a chance, I think, in the following panel with my friends and colleagues Ryan Crocker and Ashley Tellis, for them to correct everything that I just said in a wrong way. So anyway, good luck with the rest of the conference. I'm sure it's going to be wonderful, but thanks so much for this conversation, which, as always, I thoroughly enjoyed, Maha.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much.